Today I'm going to explore a topic that I have not yet talked about in video format. I only have written about this on my blog and openspartan.com, but I want to talk about the Halo Infinite API, or the application programming interface for that game right there that I'm still waiting for it to find a ranked match for me to join. But all that being said, the Halo Infinite API is an interesting topic to discuss because it actually enables anyone that plays the game to get access to information about a lot of different in-game entities. So if you ever wonder about the maps in a playlist or the stats about a specific maps or game modes, well, guess what? It's all powered by that API and can be obtained. Wondering about the skins that are available for the Spartan or new items being released this season? It's also available through that API. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So let's explore how the API actually shows up in the game. And the easiest way to do this is to actually switch to my screen here and launch the game. But before I do that, I want to call out a tool that I'm going to be using. And that tool is called Fiddler, specifically the Fiddler Classic Edition.
You could get me one of those things? I got a birthday coming up.
What it does, it basically allows me as a developer or somebody that is curious about APIs to explore those endpoints, or the URLs, if you will, the different applications hit when they run in a single interface. So I don't need to write custom code. This tool does everything for me to kind of disassemble every request, extract things like HTTP headers, and decode the content that's being returned. So very, very useful tool to have in your toolbox. So you'll look at the links in the show notes, download Fiddler Classic specifically, because I'm not a fan of the new version, but the classic one works really, really well and has worked for some years now, I think, close to a decade, more than a decade. So all that being said, let's jump into the process.
But I'm in your head and not that head. What's left of it?
So here I have Fiddler Classic running. This tool is started. I am focused on an old process, the Halo Infinite process, because what we want to do is not capture traffic from all the other applications on my Windows machine, but just Halo Infinite. This process is no longer active, so I'm going to show you how we'll select the new one, because that way we're not polluting the full list with a bunch of other calls that are being issued pretty much every second on the operating system. So next thing that we need to do as Fiddler is running, make sure that if you go to options, that you are capturing HTTPS connects and you decrypt HTTPS traffic. All the requests that the API is sending today for Halo Infinite is passed through HTTPS, or Hypertext Transfer Protocol. I think that's what it's called. And it's the secure layer of that. What this means is that the data is encrypted during transport. So if somebody comes in the middle, they are not able to read what data is being passed from service to the client, aka you, or from the client back to the service. So only the service knows, and you know the data that you need to have access to. So you need to do this. Part of this process, so what will happen is you will install a certificate that is self-signed and for your specific machine. So don't worry about installing it. This is perfectly safe if you're operating on your own machine. So we'll do that. I already have this all enabled, so I'm just going to click OK. Next, what we want to do is make sure that I set the proxy settings for my OS, and I'm going to use a terminal here with administrator privileges to use the proxy set by Fiddler. So when you launch Fiddler, what it actually does behind the scenes, it creates a proxy server that you can then use. So what we're going to do here is use a utility called Netch, or I believe it's called the network shell, or maybe that's what was the name before. But what this enables you to do is set the proxy for the entire OS to be the one that's used by IE or Internet Explorer, and that is exactly what Fiddler Classic is setting here. So I'm just going to do this, and then if things work as expected, you'll see HTTP equals 127.0.0.1, and HTTPS, it's the exact same URL. It's the exact same endpoint, right? So we should be good here. Next, let's get into the game. So for this, I actually go to my desktop here. I'm going to minimize this window and I'm going to launch Halo Infinite. So let's see what happens. As I launch the game, now I'm using the Steam version here. I'm going to go ahead and also look at Fiddler because this is going to get interesting. Right now, I'm going to drag this cursor over to the Halo Infinite process here. So we'll notice that there's some requests start flowing. This means that we actually are capturing this data. And I'm going to press enter here to play. And I'm going to switch back to Fiddler because now it's the interesting stuff will happen. Notice that there's a bunch of stuff flowing through. We care about this a lot because all of this information right now, you see data about engine game variants, you see data about the UGC game variants, and we'll talk about that in further videos. I think I need to make this a series. But effectively, all this data now starts flowing through the Halo Infinite API. Right? These are the API endpoints. There's many of them. There is discovery, infinite UGC.svc.halowaypoint.com. So there's the discovery endpoints. There's the game CMS, HACS endpoints. All of this is captured through Fiddler. So if you have this tool installed and you have configured everything correctly, you can see all the details, including the responses. And this is the interesting part. So response body is encoded. We're actually not going to get a lot of interesting information from the responses in Fiddler because what the game uses is a bond format. So I'll talk about this shortly. But now we have everything configured and we have the APIs up and running through the game. What's next?
Good job, Spa! Oh, nope, I'm gonna be sick.
What we can do with these APIs is to actually capture them and try to replay them. To do this, I'm gonna go ahead and copy one of the available URLs that we've captured with Fiddler. So let's go back to my Fiddler instance and let's say I want to find one that is interesting to me, and maybe I'm going to use the economy endpoint that talks about my inventory for my player because I have an Xbox Live ID already connected to this. So I'm just going to copy just the URL. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to close this game. And by the way, when we talk about the API and I kind of mentioned what it powers, everything that you see here is powered by that API. So like the news come from the API. If I go to multiplayer and I look at the quick play playlist and look at game list, all this information here actually comes from the API. So very, very useful to have direct access to it because then you don't need to launch the game to get that data. Other pieces that are powered by the API, well, if I look at myself and I look at the profile and things like match history and I want to track my performance, it also comes from the API. So very, very helpful to have available. We can quit the game right now because I don't need this anymore. We got the bulk of the information captured in Fiddler, and I'm gonna stop capturing here.
Spanked him? More like killed him. Am I right? He's dead.
Not really necessary because I'm not really tracking the process anymore, but nonetheless, this is where we're gonna take a pause and take the endpoints. So I'm gonna copy just the URL here as I mentioned, and what I'm going to do is use another tool that is free and I highly recommend you install that is called Postman. Postman allows you to basically play API requests manually. So I'm going to go here in the URL. I already have one API. I'm going to paste the URL that I just got that is presenting the inventory for my player. Notice that I have an Xbox ID here. This is helpful because I do have an Xbox ID tied to the game. You'll see some of the requests for the APIs included because they're specific to the player. I have the inventory kind of path, and I have a flight, which is basically the clearance ID that is another property that is exposed by the API that is tied to a specific instance of the game that you're running. So it configures it basically on the fly. And that's, by the way, totally different from flight. Flight identifiers are effectively markers for what the build configuration is. I also have a variable here that is being set through a header called X343 authorization Spartan. This is a header that's being set by the game. Computing that header or computing the value for that header is actually a somewhat convoluted process that you should refer to a blog post I wrote a while ago. It's in the description. So if you look through that content, you'll see how to go from 0 to having that particular token value that you can use here. For now, if you go to Fiddler, you can copy it as you inspect the game API requests, and I'm not going to show it here because I'm not going to leak my Spartan token. But if you look at the client headers, you'll notice this token called X343 authorization Spartan. Copy the value, set it as a variable, or just add it here directly in Postman. And then what you can do is you can send the request. Oh, looks like this one is a bad request. I wonder what that is.
Counter snipe.
So apparently for this request to be successful, I actually need to append another header that comes from the API. That is the 343 clearance for it to be successful. And this header can be extracted again through Fiddler or can be computed through the API itself that you can also look at the link in the description of this video to see how you can do this yourself. So the clearance is basically the flight parameter that you see in the API here. Now, because I have the Spartan token already set, I requested the data. Notice that it returned all the information that I have about the inventory for my player, represented by the Zuid here or the Xbox user ID. This is the full inventory of items that my Spartan has for multiplayer games. So that's fantastic. I now have a track record that I can inspect, and I can, over time, see what data I have, and I can even go to these individual endpoints. For example, if I'm curious about a specific weapon theme, and get information about that particular theme with things like the background image maybe, or the logo that's being put on my battle rifle. So, this aside, now we have an idea of how the API works, how I can go to Fiddler, I can grab the URL. That is a very, very tedious process because that means I have to go in and experiment a lot before I get all these URLs. Well, don't be so eager to do everything manually because, as it turns out, the folks at 343, when they build this, they put something very interesting in a lot of the games. And this is a thing for Halo 4, MCC, Halo 5, and of course, Halo Infinite. And what they did is build a settings endpoint here. And I'm going to also copy just the URL. I don't need anything else. And I will paste it in Postman. I don't actually need the authorization or the clearance to get data from this endpoint because I can just send it and it returns me some XML data. That's an interesting point about this API too that I'll mention is that some of the data can be returned in different formats. If you're a fan of XML, for example, match stats can be presented in XML format, they can be presented in JSON format, or they can be presented in bond format. So bond format is a binary encoding that packages things up without any structure. So if I'm looking at my configuration right now for the build that contains the endpoint with XML, it's overly verbose. There's a lot of the stuff here that is maybe not very intuitive, right? I can force this response to be JSON if I set the accept application JSON header. And then I'll send this again, and notice that now it's all JSON. Great, I get all the information about the endpoints. This was a bit of a digression, but the settings endpoint that I just talked about here returns information about all available endpoints in production builds. This is actually very fun to deal with because it gives you all the information you need to completely reconstruct the API surface for production builds. Here I'm looking right now at a huge list of origins. So authoring authority, game CMS, discovery authority, the open discovery authority. So quite a bit of stuff. And if I scroll a bit past the authorities, I'll notice that there is the endpoint section that contains Academy, get, bot customizations. And it gives me the full path, the query string parameters, and the authority. And what the authority is effectively, it's a reference to what we just saw before. So if I look at game CMS HACS, I'm going to copy this and I'm going to try finding it, and I'll go back to the very first instance. The authority is the host name. So if you take the host name and you go back to where I was just looking at and combine it with the path, you get the API endpoint that you can actually send a request to and get the data that you care about. So the same way you can get progression information, the same day you can get season reward information for anything within the game, right? So when we see a lot of these incoming Reddit posts about, a new emblem is going to be launching in a week, or a new season event is happening, they get this through this API. They look at what's being released and what is new, and then publish that information. So all of this is available through the public but undocumented API for Halo Infinite. So I'm saying it's public because it's available to you. So if you're playing Halo Infinite today, you have an Xbox Live ID, you have access to this API. It's undocumented because right now there is no documentation. 343 Industries have not actually made this public. So obviously things are bound to be, breaking, changing. There's a lot of flex happening right now, and especially as they iterate on the game, and the season 3 is going to be coming later this year, which means that there's going to be even more churn, and things that you see working today might not be working tomorrow. So this is purely an exploratory project that is not necessarily for anything production ready, and goes without saying that because you're using your own credentials and not the game to actually request these pieces of information through the API, there's a non-zero chance that the account will be banned. So I just feel like it's important to call this out, because I don't want folks to, abuse the API all of a sudden and then get their accounts locked and have no recourse to do anything about this.
Whoa, whoa, whoa! That thing is dangerous!
But now you know what the API is. This is extremely helpful to get information in JSON, XML, or bond format. That, again, is going to be a topic for another video where we're going to be talking about how you can decode information from a bond format. I will call out the fact that there's a lot of endpoints that you could look at, and if you use Fiddler while you explore, let's say, playlists, or if you try to create a copy of a game, you can look through them and see what is being done by the game, and then try to reproduce that by yourself, right? So if you look at GET requests for engine variants or map variants, all that information, there is GET requests. Fiddler gives you basically all the information that you need here to get started. And then there's also going to be some post requests, and in this case it's using the Xbox Live API, nothing super special beyond that, and that's again another topic. But use Fiddler as a reference, look at what the headers are being requested, look at the content that is being returned, look at the content that is being sent, because for some post requests there's going to be content there as well, and use Postman as your basically test bed where you can paste the content that you just saw, the URLs. You can change the return formats. You can look at specific data that is gated behind your own authorization token, the Spartan token. Then you can read more in the article linked below. And we're going to be exploring more in the future and see what are the awesome things that you can pull from the API, such as medal counts, match performance, CSR, or competitive skill rank, and even more. For details on that, I'd also recommend you check out a wrapper for the library that I've been writing called Grunt. So if you're writing C# or .NET code, you can easily just plug that in, download on NuGet. It's an open source project, and it basically encompasses more than 100 different API endpoints that I have shown in the settings endpoint here that we're looking at right now in Postman. So all of these things, you don't need to re-implement them. You can just look at Grunt, and if you ever have doubts as to how it works, that might be another reference point for you. So I hope you enjoyed this video. This is a very, very short introduction. And just as a reminder, once you're done experimenting with your Halo Infinite API plus Fiddler, make sure to reset the proxy. Make sure to go back to your admin command prompt and use another command here to just reset the proxy to the default settings to make sure that you're not, locking some applications that might be waiting for Fiddler. Because if you close Fiddler and the proxy is still set to 127.0.0.1, I've seen other apps sometimes not load because the proxy is not running. So you don't want that. Make sure to clean it up. You'll also need administrative privileges for that. You don't need to run it in the same instance of the terminal, but make sure you do that. And if you have any questions, reach out in the comments, hit me up on Twitter, and until the next video on Halo Infinite APIs.
See you